The following is a presentation of Morning Drive Media.
From the southernmost point of Dorne to the lands of always winter, and what is west of west, and the shadows in the east, this is Casterly Talk, and Rewatch is here. That's right. I am Ken Napzok, and we are beginning this journey on Casterly Talk to rewatch every episode of Game of Thrones 1 week at a time. We're going to be here a bit, and we are going to dig into the themes, the lessons, and the moments that make this show and this story a part of our hearts and our souls. And yes, this is a focus on HBO's Game of Thrones. Doesn't mean books and stuff won't get mentioned, but there's a purpose behind that. We'll explain in a second. But before we do that, very happy to have returning to this show, fates and schedules aligning. It's so hard to get things filmed and shot and recorded, but we're all trying to make ends meet and scramble and just, well, survive with what's going on. I am very happy to bring back to the show today Rachel Cushing. Hey, Rachel, how are you?
I'm very good. Excited to get back to one of my all-time faves. I love this idea so much. Going back to the beginning, watching it one episode at a time, breaking it down with themes, knowing what we know, how it ended, and going back to the beginning, and things will resonate differently. There's just, there's endless things to talk about Game of Thrones anyway, but I really like this angle.
Yeah. No, that's kind of the purpose to now that we're all wrapped up, with this version of the story, to go back and really see. And already in this episode, as we go into the pilot today, we're looking at Winter is Coming.
Oh, yeah.
I saw something and I was like, that wouldn't have meant anything to me if I hadn't seen the final episode of season 8.
Yeah.
And that's what I love here. And you know what? Yeah, Rachel and Lon and Andres and Thomas are all part of Casterly Talk. Just the lockdown has made it so that most of the episodes are me locked in my small studio talking to myself and you, the audience. But it's my intention to bring them and others onto the show, some people I haven't talked Game of Thrones with, and bring them on because we have a lot of episodes and a lot of people reaction episodes. In fact, this is why I talk about the fates align, Rachel. You reached out. We're like, hey, I get some schedule openings are coming up. I'd love to get back on Casterly Talk. I pitched this to you, and you're like, can I talk about the pilot?
Yes. Being that I was one of the first ones you told about this plan, I was like, well, if that's the case, and I'm going to put a pin in a couple episodes that I very much want to talk about. And the pilot was one of them because pilots are notoriously difficult. And the history behind this pilot was that they shot it and then they reshot nearly the entire thing because there's so much you have to set up and so much that you have to do in order to grab an audience, but also make sense of an absolutely sprawling story. So the fact that it did its job and then some is going to be fun to talk about.
Yeah, and we can't not talk about that. I mean, you have to talk about the reshoots of it. It's legendary, and it comes up from time to time again. It even kind of came up in a negative light and last year with a lot of other big kind of social issues going on around the show, around the creators, around HBO, all those kind of things, which I get, but it's baked into the conversation about this. And I'll start here, Rich, with the rewatch to all those listening on Casterly Talk, or maybe folks who are just finding me or rediscovering Casterly Talk or Daily Thrones, which it used to be, and I'm rebroadcasting these on YouTube. The purpose of this rewatch is to really dive into the themes and the moments and the lessons of the show. We will talk about foreshadowing. We will talk about predictions that went awry and things and decisions that were made that maybe we didn't agree with. That will be part of this discussion, but I really want to dig into the themes so we can analyze why this really impacted us on a large level. And if the story was in your heart already from the books, or the books came a little bit later, this is like a Star Wars, like a Lord of the Rings. It pulls us in, and I want to analyze why, because I really think that goes to the themes. And Rachel, I know you are one that this story was already in your heart before the show even hit.
Yeah, I mean, putting myself back in those shoes, almost 10 years ago, I was anticipating, but also very leery about a show that was being made based on a supposedly unadaptable series. I mean, that's what Martin set out to do, because of past, issues with Hollywood and general things along those lines. So, I'd read 4 books up until that point, and yeah, they felt unadaptable. They felt too sprawling. They felt too big. Like, how can we possibly have this many characters, this many disparate storylines, because they're all happening separate of each other for so long? It takes seasons and books for characters to start to come together. It just felt so insurmountable. But at the same time, my fantasy loving heart wanted it to be surmountable. I wanted them to get it right. And as a Lord of the Rings fan, knowing that Jackson managed to do it with those movies made me think maybe an HBO, that also big maybe. Like, they're capable of throwing the money and the production value and to get the right people, and the casting started coming out, and Sean Bean was Ned Stark. I was like, in. So like it was a very, very high sense of anticipation, but also a little fear, because I love the book so much. So
look, I don't blame you at all. I think if I would have been a book reader at that point, I would have been probably almost pre-snooty. And I'm not saying about plot or anything, but just like, I don't know. And I'm a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fan, and I do love the movie adaptation of that. But even that could be, and there's a TV show in the works for that. And I'm already kind of like arms crossed.
Exactly.
I want this to work, but I'm not sure if it will. A little context too at the time. It's 2011 when the first pilot, 2009, I believe they shot 90% of it. HBO, we always go to Sopranos and the big shows, that are there for that. But True Blood was kind of the one. That was the show that people were talking about, and this was kind of following on the shoulders of True Blood.
Yeah, because I think they were hoping to get genre fans outside of the genre that they were putting out there. So True Blood, being sort of gothic horror romance, actually attracted people who weren't normally attracted to that genre. And so it managed to make that genre appealing to a broader group of people. And so the same thing needed to happen with Game of Thrones, because while there's a lot of us fantasy nerds, there's not probably quite enough to justify the budget for a show like that could potentially go on for, at that point, they didn't know how many seasons. So
yeah,
it's really interesting that, these days, in a more modern sense, genre storytelling has taken kind of a bigger role in the industry, because they're realizing that you can do the genre, but you can do certain things with it that can appeal to a broader audience. And, and that's just smart. And they were ready to put everything they had behind it, and it worked for them.
It worked. Yeah, a little gamble, a little less budget. Season 1 and 2 weren't sure. This we'll throw out some figures and stats here. Original air date April 17th, 2011. Director Tim Van Patten. Now I think it was Tom McCarthy was the pilot director. He gets consulting producer credit. Writers, of course, Dave Benioff and D.B. Weiss. This is they come out swinging with this, and they were learning on the fly. They've admitted they kind of talked about it then, but now it's more in focus. Cinematographer Alik Sakharov, and the editing was done by Oral Nori Oti. I always want to highlight that because, Rachel, as many people know, you are a very talented editor by trade. A lot of people might know you for your movie trivia skills, but I know you first as an editor. That is key to how this show was put together. The editors, a lot of pressure on them to take a not low budget, but just a less than what it would become budgeted show and make it seem bigger.
Yeah, I mean, editors are important in any show because they are responsible for point of view. They're responsible for the rhythm, the pacing, and, just the general feel. And in this show in particular, maybe not quite as much in the pilot, but to an extent, we did jump around. We're in 4 different locations across the pilot, and that was a hallmark of the show, this all jumping around. So it's the kind of thing of like, how long can we spend in this location with these characters before people start to feel antsy about what's happening over here, which storylines are grabbing people at different times. And it just would feel like a lot, I think, to the editors to make sure that they were focusing where they needed to focus for the exact right amount of time before moving on to the next thing. And that's part of the writing as well. But I'm glad you highlighted the cinematographer too, because, there's a few broad establishing type shots, with the mats and the special effects and everything. But I really think that this pilot is shot very well to give you a real sense, particularly of Winterfell, since that's our main location. But even, King's Landing, that sort of revolving shot around Jon Arryn as he's lying in front of the Iron Throne. So you're getting a sense of the throne room and where Jaime and Cersei are. And there's just little things like that stand out to me that, for the smaller budget that they had and the risks, and the shortcuts I'm sure they had to take, it still looks expensive, real, lived in, and you get a sense of the scope of the places. So
this is why your perspective is so valuable here for what your skill set is in your professional career, because I think writing and taking the show to different places. And this episode, it says Winterfell, it says King's Landing.
Crazy. It's like the only time they actually have like it written on the screen. This is where you are. That took me by surprise this time.
Right.
Like, that they lost that. They didn't do that anymore after
you forget that. But that's it. There's so a lot is in the writing, obviously, but I really think the editing sets the tone and trains us as an audience to be like, you're gonna move around a lot. There's a lot going on, and if you're not a book reader, you're going to be lost. Particularly, particularly if you haven't got a ground base of the story. I think that's one of the victories of the editing in this episode. It trained me to be like, oh, we're going to do this.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So before we really dive in, we got calls. We always do. We get calls into the Anchor app here in Casterly Talk, and we have our good friend Eric Monroe calling in with his thoughts about the pilot and what he considers it to be. Let's hear from Eric.
Hey, Ken, Casterly Talk. So as the Casterly Talks rewatch is about to commence, it got me reflecting on right before the series aired back in 2011. I actually, a month before the pilot aired, I bought my first HD TV, which was actually a plasma TV, which doesn't even exist anymore. How times change. Now you got 4K and all that stuff. But I think with the pilot, it really was the most important episode of the entire series because it had to do two things. One, it had to satisfy the book fans, but two, and even greater, it had to draw in people like you who didn't read the books and make them want to tune in the week after, which I think the pilot absolutely did. It nailed it out of the park. But for me, it definitely was the most important episode of the series.
Look, I think there's some bigger, more technically more important episodes later on, Rachel. But in terms of pilots, and again, the legend of the reshoot of this one, I don't think Eric's wrong, because you are a book reader who was sitting there going, let me see what they got. And I was like, well, I like Lord of the Rings. It's got swords in it. Let me see if I like it.
Yeah, no, it's the most crucial episode, especially in an era where we're inundated with television choices and nobody can watch everything that airs. And so, these days, if something doesn't grab you right out of the gate, there's other things to move on to. And that was true 10 years ago as well. So, they really had to nail, the intrigue, the mystery, the characters, start the plot threads. One of the things that I think it's really does impressively, and this goes to David and Dan writing, is making sure the connections are made. So all the dialogue in this episode, all of it is crucial because they're talking about people we haven't seen yet that are going to play important roles. The dominoes are falling in such a way we know now who actually hit the first domino, being one Mr. Peter Baelish, who is not in this episode.
Yeah.
But the when the Raven comes in, Cat goes into the Godswood to tell Ned that Jon Arryn is passed. That's not the only thing you're learning in there. You're also learning how important Jon Arryn was a father figure. You're learning that Lysa, Cat's sister, was Jon Arryn's wife. And then later when she gets the second Raven from Lysa, and it's from the Eyrie, and that's important. Like the way that they weave all of the locations, the relationships, and the things, the pieces of information that are going to be important feels almost perfectly seamless. There's a couple wonky ADR lines that get thrown in here and there, but generally speaking, they're all giving us a point. Even so, the seemingly weird, shaving scene between Robb Theon and Jon Snow. The important thing in there, other than a little bit of character work, is they say that Joffrey's a right little prick.
Right. Because
they needed to plant that there, because we're going to see it later on. So like all of this stuff has to happen in 60 minutes. And
yeah.
me, that's weaving all of that together. is so super important and so well done.
Yeah, which is what I think fixed the most. It wasn't so much the acting. Yes, a lot of actors got changed. Some of that was scheduled. Some of the, chance to look at it again, I'm sure. But they say if you read the story, you hear the stories. Benny F. and Weiss are like, we put it out there. Our friend wrote on a notepad in all caps, massive problem, and it was about what you were just describing. So they went back in and they fixed it. And as someone, I'm tuned to this stuff in terms of Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, and I watched that stuff. I didn't feel lost. And I know other people have said, too many characters. But, and I know that's how you watch things. It might be different than me. But I think because of the way this episode was set up, I didn't feel too lost. I was learning things with everybody, but I didn't feel too lost. I wasn't where you were like, oh, yeah, I know this. But, yeah. Rachel, let's dive in. This is the meat of this eel pie that Tyrion would enjoy some wine here. We are going to be presenting themes and lessons. We're going to talk about our favorite moments, foreshadowing things that mean more now, all those things. But I want to lead with these themes here, Rachel, and to those listening and watching. We're gonna dive in. We're gonna a free-form conversation. I'll present some. Rachel will present some too here. I do want to start us off, Rachel, with what I believe could be called maybe the big theme of this episode. And it's, to me, comes a little bit out of what Tyrion says, what he says to Jon Snow, the famous thing, never forget what you are. The rest of the world will not. Wear it like armor. It can never be used to hurt you. That's this big, powerful statement that people remember. And to me, that flows into what I call the desired identities versus expectations. Who versus what. What you are or what you think you might want to be isn't necessarily who you are or who you want to be. And that's where it starts. Where does Tyrion's line just kind of land for you in the theme?
Yeah, I think your phrasing is much better than mine. I phrased it as, I was struck by how many people felt like outsiders who were playing a role that they didn't want to play. And, there's obvious ones and then there's slightly less obvious ones. But like in that moment, both Jon and Tyrion have this, glaring thing about them that the world sees and judges them for. And therefore they're only allowed to do certain things within the world based on those. It's an assumption on Jon's part. Turns out not to be true. The line is like, if they think it would be an insult if amongst the royals, if a bastard was amongst their midst, when in fact he is the royal and Joffrey, Tom, and Myrcella are the bastards. But that idea that's so integral to who Jon is, his identity as a bastard and what that means for what he's able to do in his life. And he thinks joining the Night's Watch is pretty much his only option. Tyrion, being a dwarf, it calls forward to the trial scene. You've all judged me based on this. Forget about everything else. You won't hear anything else. But, Arya is another really prime example of, being forced into one role and very clearly not wanting to be that. And does she even have a line in this episode? Like, she shoots the arrow when Bran is practicing, which is when she's supposed to be doing needlework. I mean, that says 1,000 things right there about her character. And that's perfect because that's a show not tell situation, which is always something in visual storytelling that we want to, don't just rattle all the names off to us, and tell us about characters, show us. So she's good. Bran is going to feel this way because he wants a very certain thing that is very plausible. He wants to be a knight. He wants to be a soldier, as Robert tells him. But by the end of this episode, that's going to be taken away from him. So then who is he? And Cersei, I think, falls into the category, even Cat to an extent. Theon, certainly, is he a Stark or is he a Greyjoy? There's so much about identity that I think you absolutely nailed.
Yeah, no, we're in sync here, which is why I love it. And to be clear for those listening, this is part of the fun is like Joseph Skirmish and I do it on Force Center too, of like, what do we each see here? Because that just kind of, confirms some things that are there. If we're both seeing some of the stuff there, and I love this, and you're listing some of them, I'll run down. Arya doing needlepoint, Arya with needles, just cool, by the way, but not being happy about it. And those expectations, you are a thought, there's a thought of you're a girl in this land, you must be this, and she doesn't want that. Bran, being just expected to, you got to shoot this arrow. You're expected to watch Will's beheading. You're a young man. You're a man. This is what you must do. And we're going into this world that's created, but it definitely bleeds over into our world here. Jon expected to be a bastard. What is that? Sansa wants to be a queen. She's going to learn a lot about that, what that really means and who she is beyond that. Even Viserys wants to be a king. That's desired identity versus expectations. Jaime and Cersei, by the way, they don't want to be siblings.
Very
And one of the big ones here, and we'll come to what are some, I think, are some sub themes. But one of the big ones, you mentioned Dany here. Yeah, Dany does not want to be Drogo's queen. There is, of course, an already controversial scene, even back then, of their slight adjustment of the Khal Drogo, Daenerys Targaryen consummation scene. It's played differently in the show. Let's just say that. Not a lot of consent there, and they focused on that. And what I try to take out of that is a big lesson and theme for Dany. She just wants to be on a path in which she is controlled, and she is in control of her mind, body, purpose, and goals. She has none of that right now, and that sets her off. And I think that factors in down the line when she senses loss of that control, right or wrong.
Yeah.
She said get an axe on it there. So any thoughts on some of that stuff there that I dumped onto this platter?
Yeah. For Dany, I think it was the writers feeling the need to double down on her having, as you put it, no control in any aspect whatsoever. And so if you put a character at the absolute lowest of lows, then it's a journey to build it back up. I think that sometimes can be a little reductive. I don't necessarily know. She was still at a really low, but to have, an inkling of a say in that moment as she does in the book, could have been the first step in a different trajectory. And I think it would have worked just as well.
Yeah. And I want to dig in on that a second there. Without a doubt, 2011 is eons ago, and expectations for some of these scenes, things we maybe don't want to see in these type of scenes, and things we want to see, what you're describing, which was, already in the book. George does some weird things in the books, but this is something I think I'm more in line to. And that is interesting to me to know just the context of the time. I think we are in a better spot, and we just as an audience have a little bit more expectations. If you're going to use rape as a plot point, you damn well better be sure you're handling it in the best way possible, and that you're not just shoving it into a story to bring some sort of effect. Because what you're describing, I think, could have been just as effective.
Yeah, I mean, and you're right. And we have a different lens. We have a 10-year later lens where, we've been through a lot as just a society and culture in terms of viewing these types of things. So, it happened. It was the decision they made at the time. It does work on a macro level in terms, I understand the reasoning behind it. I understand putting somebody in this position and then for us to be able to watch them to dig themselves out, to grow. And it's a bookend, from that scene to the dragons being born at the end of the season. There's an arc there, and I get it. But I do think, down the line someday when this all gets remade again, that there might be a little more nuance in, decision making about stuff like that.
Are you suggesting a Game of Thrones just reboot? Are you I might be for it. I
have a feeling that if nothing else, the final season will encourage somebody in the near future to redo the whole thing and try to one-up it. I think it's going to be a very difficult task.
Yeah.
So who knows at that point if we have more books. So, I think Hollywood is what it is, and that at some point somebody's going to pitch.
I could see that. And two, kind of a little micro point Rachel kind of brought up there. It's like in going into the themes, and we always say at Force Center to engage with the story presented to you. Part of it will be even some of the decisions or scenes or moments or how they're played that maybe we don't agree with. We're definitely going to address that, but also just look at what's there for the story for us to learn from. And that's why I think this moment, like you said, Rachel, I understand it does work and not totally just tossing it aside, but I'm thankful that as an audience, we want more out of these stories and how they're executed. We want more out of them.
Definitely. There's a reasonable, respectable way to talk about it and not condemn them for it for something. At the time.
Couple sub themes here, and then I'd love to hear anything that I've missed or that you interpreted different here. Let me just get your thoughts on these. I have this idea of, and it's a theme, but it's like a lesson for the show too. and what something they're presenting early on is who we view as the villains and who we view as the heroes. And we know a lot of that gets changed along the way. You and I in past episodes have just talked about the scenes we love of Jamie talking about, with Bran in the bath, about how that flips things. But let me just go into this and I'll get your thoughts on it. The Wildlings, as they're called here, are immediately positioned as trouble, savages. And the Night's Watch is also positioned pretty immediately. This opening scene, Raymer Royce, I wouldn't say he's noble, but they're positioned as having this noble purpose upon meeting Benjen. That, to me, sets the tone for almost tricking us to go a direction that we would naturally just go as an audience, like, oh, well, those are the bad folks. And it's part, to me, Jon Snow's journey of viewing them as wildlings to free folk to becoming one of them at the very end. And I thought that was interesting that that's right there in the cold opening, Rachel.
Yeah, this show, and Martin in particular, loved to subvert expectations. I mean, I think he gets a ton of glee out of it. And as a reader and a viewer, I do too, because most of the time it's not a sharp right turn for no reason. It always adds up, or usually adds up to those turns, to those twists. And the more information you get, the more you realize, oh, this isn't what I first thought based on what I was presented with, but it makes sense given all these other little pieces that we're seeing along the way. And I love that the very first line that any character speaks is from Waymar Royce, and he's talking to Will, who said he saw the dead wildlings, and he says, "What did you expect? They're savages." Yeah. And it's funny to me, that's the first line of the entire series. I'm like, applicable in many, many ways to many, many characters overall, and it's being associated with this one group that potentially we know nothing about, so there's the assumption made, but then it's overturned over the course of time. And I do love that. I love that about the books and Martin in general, and that the show follows through with that in the big ways, Red Wedding, and in the small ways, like a journey to coming to like characters that are wildlings, or various things like that. So I mean,
we're looking at the first sequence to the last of just played those two scenes, and it's this show obviously isn't just Jon and the free folk. I get it, but it's Jon Snow, and he's this big guy. That's why I always say the thought that he is the boy who would be king is not necessarily Jon's arc. It's what we're taught to believe, just years and years and years of pulling swords out of stones and getting lightsabers given to us. And watching this today, even just as we're getting ready to record, I'm like, I've always loved this opening sequence. I'll talk about it again in terms of favorite moments, but I'm like, wow, you put this in the last scene and just what those scenes are telling us. I love that stuff. A couple ones here. We got Tyrion and the Hound. We're immediately kind of positioned to look at them in a certain way. Lannisters, the death of Jon Arryn. You mentioned it. What we're immediately assuming with the death of Jon Arryn. This is about our lessons as an audience about who we view as the villains and the heroes. And even I've talked about a lot. You and I have talked about it too here. King Robert. And I do love, I love Mark Addy, but I have a love for King Robert. I think he's far from perfect, but we are immediately taught, Rachel, oh, he's Ned's friend. He's going to be okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like we realize eventually, and it's hinted at in this show, when Ned says that, Bran's only 10, but he won't be forever. He's growing up into an adult, and he has to face the realities of adult. And he's also going to have to face the realities of being a main protagonist, because the older generation is passing the torch. This is weirdly a coming of age series, for a lot of these characters, Jon, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Theon, there's so much, they start out sheltered and believing certain things. And one of the lessons, I know jumping ahead a little bit, I was thinking it was like sort of be careful what you wish for, like Sansa wanting to be the queen. Like, it's the only thing I ever wanted is to marry Joffrey. You don't know what you're asking for, and you're going to find out, and you're going to learn that lesson. And they all have to learn to be careful. And the things that you think you want now based on your very tiny sheltered point of view of everything are going to change very much over the course of 8 seasons.
I love that you highlight that as a lesson. That's very valuable. Final thoughts from here on some sub themes and destinies. Destiny is a big theme I want to get into, but facing truth and not wanting to face truth, kind of tagging on what you just said, or the big lesson of it might be what you want, but do you really, and can you face that truth? But here's some ones. and it's not just about us in the real world, which is a lot of these themes and lessons and how I love they connect with us. But looking ahead to the story, Ned and Roderick seem to me, I want to get your thoughts. Ned and Roderick seem to immediately know something is different with the execution of Will, the eyes they look, finding the dire wolf. That's a truth, I think, in their hearts. They're both like, well, these are the stories we always heard about. This doesn't seem good. And are they going to face that or not? You know, did you ever interpret that, those eyes, those looks between Roderick and Ned?
And particularly when Benjen talks to Ned, because not only, talk of White Walkers, dire wolves south of the wall, and then he said, you being the hand of the king, like, world's coming to an end. Like, these are all very strange things. But the idea being that if people had believed Will, had investigated what he said, things would be like, it's one of those pivot points that you don't realize is a pivot point until later. And you're like, man, you guys would have gone in a very, very, very different way if you had taken him at all seriously. You understand why they don't. And we get doubled down on that with Maester Luwin talking to Bran about snarks and grumpkins and the things that we believed as kids, because, we all believe about the monster under the bed. They're not real. This is a world where they technically did exist thousands of years ago, though. So there's the room for, well, maybe. And Starks are generally the people who are always prepared for the worst. Winter is coming. Those are their words. Ned has lived his whole life, especially when you think about Robert's rebellion and everything that happened to his father and his brother and everything, things will go wrong. Things will go bad. Things will be unexpected. You wish he'd taken those lessons a little bit further later on when he's in King's Landing and he's playing the Thrones. But as a Stark, I think that hearing about White Walkers, seeing dire wolves and things like that would, raise the antenna, if you will.
Yeah, I love what you said about Will. If you just listen to this guy who his words are pretty haunting, and I love that he's just kind of like, yeah, I know I got to go tell my family, but I know. And Benjen backs that up. And the title of the episode is Winter is Coming. And that's house words we've always loved. And it's always tied it to the show when it comes back. And winter finally is here. And just in terms of plot. But I think as a big theme and lesson for this episode, winter is coming. Sometimes it's this big thing in the world. Sometimes it's something in your life. And can you face that truth? Catelyn has the truth about Jon in front of her face. And can she face the truth that maybe she didn't treat him right? Jon's facing this truth about being a bastard, going back to desired identities and what you're talking, the excellent points you made about Tyrion. I think all that stuff is there. And again, go to Bran. Ned gives the big speech we'll talk about in the second half of the show here, or the great big line that to me is the quote of the episode. But when Bran gets that, swing the sword thing, he immediately is like, is it true about the White Walkers? Like, immediately throws it back because he's clued in. He doesn't have those dreams yet, maybe, but and Ned doesn't want to face it. He maybe can't face it with his 10-year-old son. But you can tell Ned's like, oh God, I don't want to face that.
Yeah, exactly. Not on top of everything else.
Before I get into Destinies, any other themes and lessons that you want to talk about or add to anything I've barfed up already?
One of the things that really strikes me, and it's actually best encapsulated in the house words of a different house, which is House Tully. And what is it? Family, duty, honor, I believe is their house words. And what strikes me about the pilot, having watched the whole series, is loyalty, and in ranking your loyalty. What are you loyal to first, second, third? Like, what's your motivation for things? Because loyalty is very clearly very important to Ned. And he's, so loyal to Robert, who's his best friend, who he helped win the Seven Kingdoms with. And then when he finds out he's going to be in danger, it's one of the reasons that he ultimately does accept the Hand of the King ship and goes. But we know that there's something, we eventually find out there's something that he's more loyal to. And that was Lyanna and the vow that he made. And people talk about oaths in this episode a lot. The Knight's Will broke his oath. That's why he has to die. And the idea of everybody's motivated to act based on their loyalty. But what are they loyal to? Their family, their king, their house. The Tywin Lannister's coming, and it's Lannister. That comes above everything. but you might be loyal to a person, Jaime and Cersei. You might be loyal to your ambition, Peter, Varys. Like, there's so much that's driven by who's loyal to what, and it's becomes surprising. It's one of those things where, like, you think somebody's loyal one way, and then you find out later there's actually something else happening, and it drives so much of the action. And I think it's very clear right off the bat that people are loyal to certain things, and those loyalties will be tested many times.
You just said something that just it got a boom, which makes me feel like a dad joker, but which, you know, I am, even though I'm not a dad, let's be honest. Know that we love this show for its plots, its twists, its turns, and I am all in on that. Everyone should know. But in applying themes to them, what you just talked about loyalty and these words and these houses and and who's loyal to what, like you said, fuels the action, but it's also
character.
It asks us that question along the way, and it plays with that constantly. That's why I love the lesson of, because I'm all in. When I was watching the show season 1, I was like, yeah, those damn wildlings, and they come down and they want to kill Bran, and along the way, I'm learning the lesson with Jon. Who am I loyal to? This noble. I'm wearing a Night's Watch hat. I love the Night's Watch just for silly reasons and personal reasons, but what is my loyalty to people, to human? So I've got to learn it too along the way. I think that's an excellent point, and to use the house words to explain it, ranking your loyalty. We might all have to do it.
Yeah.
Great one, Rachel. Any other ones before I dive into destinies in this show?
No, I think there's, like you said, sub threads. Like, I think that it establishes houses and legacies. Loyalty to your house means being loyal to what do you leave behind. And it's Ned passing on to Robb and Jon, and ultimately to Sansa, which isn't quite readily knowable at this point. The Lannisters, you get that sense, especially with the Tyrion, his sort of point of view versus Cersei and Jaime, and and we'll get more of that the more houses that we learn about. But I think Robert is talking about that when he's talking to Ned about, I need you to be my hand because you helped me win the 7 kingdoms, now help me run them. We were born to do this, the crypt. So it's tied into loyalty is this idea of houses and family, and that starts to become clear in the pilot and obviously over the course of the series.
Yeah. Dynasties, as Cersei and Tywin would say. Speaking of close to that, dynasties is also destinies. Obviously, this is one of those shows. You and I, we love Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings like nothing else. You're an absolute expert on Lord of the Rings, and it is that classic myth. I'm just, my life is Star Wars. It is the modern myth, speaking to the 12-year-old in all of our hearts. So destinies, without a doubt, are going to be part of this, even if it's George R.R. Martin's The Taxes of Aragorn the day after he becomes king kind of show that George R.R. Martin always talks about, love doing it. Destinies are just being sold right from the beginning. So it's definitely a theme. And what we think of destinies, I always view destiny is actually the journey to a key point of choice or many points of choice. But along the way, here we are. We're presented with many, Rachel. We got Jon and Dany, obviously, Song of Ice and Fire, start in low positions, but we immediately get the sense more is coming, and that's coming for me as watching this on April 17th, 2011, going, I think they have some books about these. Let me just figure this out. And immediately I'm like, oh, okay. We got something going on with these two. Destinies are big. We also got Ned must go face his destiny. Bran literally falls into his destiny. Even Viserys, he thinks there's a destiny, and he says this great line, how do we go home with an army? He's saying it to Dany, and there's some destiny in there, too, for her. What do you mean about destinies, particularly Jon and Dany in the beginning of their journeys?
Definitely, because even though it's not readily apparent, it's more apparent when you get to the end of the season and Dany's reborn in fire, like literally, and the dragons. But, her stepping into that scalding hot bathtub speaks to the fire-blooded nature of the Targaryens, juxtaposed with the cold of Winterfell and the cold open and Jon Price joins the Night's Watch and everything. So you definitely have representations of both of them within that fire ice dichotomy, and then knowing that they're going to rise up through the ranks in both of those respective areas and then come together with them is very poetic and sort of traditional, but it's Martin, so he's not going to do it quite in the same traditional way. And of course, with Mad Queen Dany, that's where you really get the left turn expectations part of it. But yeah, it's great because it's still a fantasy series, and almost every time I do a podcast or something about Game of Thrones, I always tend to mention that because it's what brought me to it in the first place, and the fantasy elements are important to me. I love that he balances them out so well with more reality based type of problems and ruling and factions and relationships and the machinations of the Game of Thrones. And that's all rooted in people. And that's important, because if you care about the people, then when the fantasy enters the lives of the people, then you're more invested with it, and it all melts together really well. So, but destiny is a huge fantasy trope. It's something that that exists in every fantasy story ever. So it makes sense that it would here, and that they feel like traditional destinies. Again, Bran is probably going to be a knight. Sansa's probably going to be a queen. Even Ned being, the Grand Vizier, like the Hand of the King. These are all things we know within this realm. But it's Martin, and he's going to twist those destinies in ways that are unexpected, but still feel very rooted in the real world that he's created.
Yeah. I'll throw something to you here that a little off our path here, but your thoughts on what destiny is. And I'll preface it by saying again what I said is I have a strong belief that destiny is truly not that you are the boy who would be king or the girl who would be queen. It is, and that is going to happen regardless. You still along the way have to make these choices. The fall of Darth Vader, he is destined to be the chosen one, but along the way the choices can change that. And there's a lot of things. So I think later on in Game of Thrones, there's some choices or things that are done that don't maybe align with the traditional destiny idea. But how do you look at destiny, not just in Game of Thrones, but in all of these things, including our beloved Lord of the Rings?
Sure. No, I love the idea. And I mean, you just said it, it's about choice, because, in Lord of the Rings, you have the man who would be king, but he has to choose to follow that path. He has to make the hard decisions along that path to go there. And weirdly, Tolkien sort of rips the expectation rug out from under us too with Frodo, because he chooses not to throw the ring into Mount Doom. And it's but then it was Bilbo's choice to spare Gollum in The Hobbit that leads us to the point where Gollum is actually the one who tries to take the ring and it falls in. So both of those trajectories were based on choices, sort of unexpected choices. So in Game of Thrones, I think it's something similar. But I think it's not so obvious in the choices. I think it's more about all the little choices, because that feels more grounded to have all the little things add up to Arya sailing for Braavos. It wasn't one thing. That wasn't what she set out to do. That wasn't necessarily a destiny per se. She was trying to survive. She's trying to get back to her family, and she tries to get back to this family member. They're gone. She tries to get back to this one. They're gone. She gets to River Run when Red Wedding, like all of these things add up to, okay, in this moment, okay, here's a bigger choice. All these little choices, here's the bigger choice. And now I'm going to go this way, but it makes sense. And so the destinies, I guess, are more about not the I will become queen, I'll become leader, I'll become this or whatnot. It's guiding the paths of people and yourself to get to those bigger moments. And like you said, sometimes your destiny for a cause or for a people or for a thing that is bigger than yourself. So your destiny is to die for it, or to, Theon, he dies mostly just as like a delaying tactic. A lot of people felt it was sort of a throwaway, like what was the point of that? But I do think there was a point to that. Like, it delayed the action, it delayed everything that was happening around them just enough to get people where they needed to be for things to happen. But everything that happened before that is almost as important, or even maybe more important than that moment. So
and I think Theon gets to choose to die for a Stark and as a Stark in a way, though at that point maybe Bran wasn't anything, as as Brad would say. All right, so here's what we're going to do. If you're listening on the audio podcast, and I hope you are, we are available on Anchor, Apple Podcasts, and all the spots. We're going to take a break. The music will play, but we're going to stay here recording on YouTube. Have a minute or two of bonus content while I switch files out. It's the old podcast thing. You're watching a podcast being recorded. That's what we're doing here. So stick around. Casterly Talk. The rewatch has begun. More on the other side. All right, Rachel. As I switch file, I have a question I've always really wanted to know. As you are as we say, you are a book reader who went into the show having just intimate knowledge with what this was and what you wanted it to be. What after the pilot? What do you think was the one singular character that you were like, yes, they nailed what I've always envisioned that character to be?
I mean, the easy answer is Ned. I sort of knew going in because I adore Sean Bean. He brought Boromir in the Lord of the Rings to life in a way that I always knew existed in the books, but, hadn't ever really been, articulated that well. And so when I knew that he would be good, and then he was as good, if not better. Mark Addy was a surprise because it's the dichotomy in the book too. It's like Robert Baratheon was this larger than life monster of a fighter who, let the drinking and everything else get to him at this point. And I remember thinking Mark Addy and going, I can't see him as the fighter that gone to, that transition in my brain wasn't working. But the way he carries himself when he gets down off the horse and he like stomps over to Ned, and they're great greeting. They're masterful, like, you got fat, and then Ned just looks at him and they both die laughing because that's the friendship that you feel it immediately in that moment. But I felt Mark Addy embodied somebody who used to be this way and has sort of, gone to pasture a bit based on all of the choices over the last 15 years.
Yeah. He to me still is one of I wouldn't say unsung hero. You're singing praises. He's not unsung indeed, but because he's season one, he's kind of maybe overlooked a lot. I mean, I'm someone who it's like you see the name and I'm like, he was in the Full Monty, right? That's my only frame of reference. Yeah. So I don't know if you're more of a cinephile than I am. You might have known a little bit more of his work and his work in comedy, whatever. But yeah, that might have seemed like a really weird choice at the time. Like, even if you could picture a big bushy beard on him.
Right. Yeah, it was, that was the surprising one. But it's hard to tell with the kids in the pilot because none of them had enough to do. I do think that Rob was he didn't have a lot of lines, but he always carried himself very well, and he has a look on his face a lot of times when he's looking at John, and you can see like the brother relationship there, which isn't being compared to like where Theon fits into the whole thing. Every time I watch the early seasons, I think more and more highly of him as an actor. I think that he's doing a lot with a character that frankly wasn't big in the books. Essentially, I mean, he is big in importance, but not a POV and everything else. And he does a lot with what the writers were trying to give him in the show in that, following Ned. Because I think Kit Harington, by contrast, took a while to grow into the role of Jon Snow.
I agree with that. Yeah. No. Yeah. Richard Madden, man. Richard Madden, folks. He's now gotten some more accolades as an actor, but I think underrated indeed. All right, we're going to come back here on the podcast side of Casterly Talk. All right, we are back here on Casterly Talk. It's me, Ken Napzok, and Rachel Cushing, the new co-host of the Schmodown Backstage show. Rachel, congratulations on that.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to crossing swords with Ben Bateman and discussing the show we both love.
That's going to be fun. Rachel and I are not crossing swords here. I think we're having a lot of fun. At least I hope you are, Rachel, digging into the big themes of the pilot episode. Thanks for those listening on the podcast. We also are available on YouTube at my YouTube channel, Ken Napzok. Just search it, find it out. You'll see my now probably more sweaty face as it's getting close to 110 degrees in the valley this weekend. I feel as though I'm in Dorne, Rachel.
Ugh, it's terrible.
We are going to move a little past the themes and the lessons, the big meat of our conversation. We're going to go into actual stuff in the show. And before we do that, I got a call here from Sarah Rissling, who is also a big fan of the movie Snowdown. And she has a call about why we're invested in a GOT and the pilot rewatch. So here we go with Sarah.
Hey, Ken and Casterly Talk fans, this is Sarah. I was getting ready for our rewatch and thinking to myself why I'm so invested in Game of Thrones and the Song of Ice and Fire. And I immediately thought of the very beginning of both the book and the TV series, starting with that foreshadowing of the stag and the direwolf and the direwolf puppies that are handed out to the children and how that meant something. It's the first time that you see as an audience that you'll be rewarded if you pay attention, if you are listening, that you will get rewarded in later on in the story. But then I also am wondering, is it a setup? Did we all start looking for that foreshadowing and everything, and why we still talk about all of the different, the prince who was promised, and all of those single nuggets hoping for something more? Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. This is we're going to get into our favorite little foreshadows in this episode, and there's without a doubt a lot. Rachel, you already mentioned one of my favorites, and it's one of the first ones I think people go back and watch and pick up on. That's Dany in the bath. It's so hot. Oh, and you're like, I know she's a dragon. Now you pick up on it. And again, I know you had a lot of knowledge going in, so you might have had a lot more fun and a different perspective on it. The dire wolf, the stag, the signs of what's to come, and as well as the pups and John with Ghost, all that stuff. So we'll dive into that. But to Sarah's point, I would love to get your thought on it. Now that we're all wrapped up with the show, and this is part of the reason I want to go into the themes. I loved digging, and I had the L+R = J t-shirt, and I had all that, absolutely. George built that into the show, or into the story. The show had to take some of that, and the show played with some of that, but I think the show never, in retrospect, and this is something I wouldn't have said watching it for season 4, 5, and 6, where I'm telling friends, you get ready for this. It was, I don't think the show had a chance. It was never going to be able to dive into these as much. So I don't think, to Sarah's point, I don't think we were wrong for looking, and I don't think the show was wrong for having a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of foreshadowing, but it might have been impossible. And I'm not saying this is fact. I'm definitely not saying this is fact. It's just my thought at this point in my Game of Thrones fanship that I don't know if they even ever were going to have a chance to really kind of deliver on all of our expectations on these prophecies and foreshadowings.
Yeah, I think that as much as I will, and I mean the praise that I give the show for juggling as much as it did, that's a layer that works better in the written word. Somebody saying a prophecy, they only ever did it the once with Maggie the Frog, and they diluted it just to really be about, her not marrying the prince, marrying the king, and outliving her children. The other prophecies, Witch of High Heart and things of like that, what do you do in the show? You just meet a character who says a bunch of words, and it stops things down, and then most of it doesn't make sense until after, Amethyst in her hairnet, that doesn't mean anything until you get there, and then you look back on it. And then, the idea of, Azor Ahai and the prince who was promised, they would throw around bits of it, like with Melisandre and stuff like that. But I think they were too worried about backing themselves into that corner where you have a frenzy of fans doing all of that stuff, when in fact you do need to be considering plot and moving forward and whatnot. So I do think that there are some aspects where all of that works better in a book than it does on a television show that is already ridiculously dense. So
Yeah, and this is not, I'm generally so positive on this show, but this is not to defend any mistakes or choices that they made that weren't popular. As producers and writers and the creators making this, they had to focus on, for a TV show, they had to focus on these big themes, these myths and these destinies, to carry their story forward. Just as it more, the plots, the devices, and all that stuff, and the twists and turns are definitely there. And again, not saying everything was done perfectly. I'm just saying that's why I'm, especially now on this rewatch, want to focus on that and continue to get rewarded by what was presented to me and all of us in the story. But it's a fair question. But that said, Rachel, there's foreshadowing, and I love it. And I'm going to list some little ones, some big ones. I want to hear from you, and we'll dive into this one here. We got Arya with Needle right there. You go, oh, look at that. The dire wolf and her pups. We know Ned's death with the beheading and the swinging of the sword. Danny in the bath. We talked about Benjen. I always talk about things with more meaning, and we'll get to that in a second. But Benjen's arrival matches his death. But there's in that conversation when he tells Jon the wall isn't going anywhere. That's the first time we're told, here's something that a character believes it's probably not going to remain true. Mm-hmm. And then final one for me, Danny gets the dragon eggs. Any thoughts from you and ones I've certainly missed?
Yeah, well, it's the one that sticks out. I mean, the dead direwolf and the stag, huge. The spirals with the White Walkers, not so much foreshadowing, but just like an image that we will come back to. A lot of stuff is like line based like that, but the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword is so integral to who Ned is as a character, and in that moment passing that down, because when you consider it, Jon has to do it in the series. Yeah. Robb does it in the series. Theon does it in the series when he kills Roderick Castle and when he takes over Winterfell. So the idea that this is so ingrained into Ned and being a Stark in the North and everything else, and it's in such opposition to most of the rest, who are like, sentence somebody to die and then send somebody else to do it. I mean, Ilyn Payne is right. Person who does it for the king. So it's a very important aspect that says a lot about the Starks, but then more so leaning into what I was talking about before about the show being a coming of age story and passing, the world on to the next generation, that all three of them do what Ned taught them to do. I think resonates a lot.
I love that you said that. I love because it's always the first thing when you hear that Ned quoted, you go, oh, that's his death. Even I just mentioned it, that he's basically, we know where that's going to go for him. But I love what you just said. That goes back to a theme of just this legacy, this generational thing, passing it on. That's powerful stuff, that they're all going to have to deal with this at some point in some way. Yeah. Comes from Danny, or comes from Ned.
Right. One other tiny one that I caught when King Robert meets the Stark children, he says to Bran, "You're going to be a soldier," and I feel like that's a very deliberate choice of word, because I would think it would be a knight.
Oh yeah.
But a soldier or fighter, Bran does become one, but in a very different way. And I do think there's a lot of talk in the episode too about seeing things. And again, knowing that Bran's going to take that on in a literal way, as his superpower, if you will, that there's just, it's just words, but you hear the word oath thrown around a lot. You hear the word seeing thrown around a lot. And again, knowing what we know, it's like, yeah, we're leading somewhere with this stuff.
It's pretty crazy when you think that this ends with Bran seeing something that no one else knows, and to see where he goes with that and see what happens to him later on.
He's the first one to see King Robert coming. He sees what happens between Jaime and Cersei. There's a lot there. There's a lot.
I love that. And that flows kind of into things with more meaning, because you actually, I don't think I've ever really written this or thought about this in the rewatch. And this, I always say, the pilot episode, Winter's Coming, is the episode I've seen the most, because every rewatch begins with it. It's a fun episode just to kind of watch. Some days you're like, I want to go back and see, 12-year-old, Robb Stark. I mean, I know Richard Madden's older, because they're also young. But yeah, Bran is the one who's like, I saw the king. And it's like, oh man, kid, you are the king.
Yep.
You know, here's some of the ones that mean scenes that mean more now. These aren't necessarily just about foreshadowing. They're just kind of fun too. This is fun. Now, and sometimes it's sad. We know that.
Say my top one is because it's sad.
Yeah, Robert at Lyanna's tomb, which also ties into the theme of facing truths. You know, it's the lie that launched the war, as we learn later on. But we got Robert at Lyanna's tomb, and then the feather, which, interesting enough, in the original pilot was Cersei burns it. It would not have factored in. They keep it, and it comes back later.
Comes back later. Yeah.
I've talked about this before. Benjen's arrival mirrors his death. John swinging a sword, kind of fighting, and he comes running in. It just kind of, not super deep, but just I've always loved that poetry. John Aaron's death, you mentioned it. Now we know more about that. We blamed Cersei and Jaime in this episode, if you're just kind of following along. I love Bran's archery lesson when that comes back as a memory, just kind of has a more bittersweet feel to it. Arya really studies the Hound. I never really paid attention to it. She's really, because he's got the cool Hound helmet, right? Hound helm. I've worn one too. They're great. I was drawn down on that, Rachel. Just like she's studying this guy that's going to change her life, and she'll change his, and go back to their final moments in season 8. Essentially, I think he kind of saves her life in a way, or at least sends her on a better path. More to talk about that. Of course, I'm just talking in general terms, but I never really picked up on that. We see the Hound through her eyes.
Right. It's that edit. It's like we see her watching and then you see him next. And you're like, and it's funny because the Hound only has the one tiny interaction with Tyrion in the episode. It's just enough because we're going to get so much of him. But it's like they knew he was important enough of a character to make sure that helmet was the most striking, almost ridiculous thing you've ever seen, but it draws your eye. It's like, what on earth? And then you have this, off color, ridiculous thing with Tyrion. It's just enough for a character that's going to become very important that they managed to get in here amongst everything else.
And I would say things with more meaning now. Tyrion's hair in the pilot has more meaning because we'll never see it again. There's some great stuff with Illyrio, what I call kind of lying, or at least telling half-truths to him about, what they call you, they praise your name in Westeros. They love that. And the reason I highlight that, Rachel, we are definitely later on in life, because this is going to be a long rewatch for Casterly Talk. The idea that upon returning to Westeros, Dany was raised with this idea of, they sing the Targaryen name in halls. And not that she didn't have supporters there, but like she gets over there and it's like, that ain't what's happening. So Illyrio, he's saying it to Viserys, but she's there witnessing. And I've always that has a little more meaning for me now.
Yeah, that's definitely, I'm actually, one of the things I was a little sad about was, Illyrio sort of being dropped as a character in the show. I get it. They don't go down the road that he would be more involved with in terms of storylines and whatnot, but he really does play his part so well in that scene. He's so grovels perfectly for Viserys, and he says all the right things in all the right ways. And I totally this is more of like a favorite little just tidbit. I love when he gives Dany the dragon eggs. Look at Viserys's face in the background. Harry Lloyd nails why didn't he give those to me? Like that jealous, like what on it's pitch perfect. Awesome. Harry Lloyd is great.
And Roger Elam is Allam. Roger Elam. A lot of times we don't talk a lot about these supporting actors that show up all the way through. He's great as Illyrio. And I agree, because season 5 when Tyrion gets back over there and he's at Illyrio's house, I'm like, great, we're gonna get some scenes. Oh, we're not. Okay. One of the things that got me. This one here, have you ever really thought on this one here? When Robert is there, the great scene that you mentioned of him getting off the horse and Ned. As he's going down the line, he says to Arya, "Your name is Arya," and I'm like, that I never back then would have, that name means a lot. That her ownership or belief in that name when she does or does not have it is pretty important. Yep. So those are some of my ones. Do you have any that I missed or anything you want to add? Please jump in there.
The thing that really struck me rewatching it, and it has struck me in the past too, is Catelyn and to a certain degree Cersei. Catelyn is a difficult character to like sometimes, slightly more in the books than in the show, but a lot of people feel like her dislike of Jon is, really difficult and irrational. Now I just find it kind of tragic because, Ned never cheated on her. And so she has this anger, in her heart, and it's all this pent up, and she can't let it go. We learn later that she's tried and she can't do it, is not based on the truth. And, that's very, tragic for a character who's very clearly, and Cersei too, especially the beginning, their identities are very wrapped up in their children.
Yeah.
And the scene between Sansa and Cat, when Cat's trying to temper that enthusiasm about running off to the capital and marrying a stranger and becoming queen and all this stuff. And from her point of view, she's about to lose her daughter. And that's a very difficult thing. And then you realize, after the first episode and the beginning of episode 2, how many of these characters never see each other again?
I know. Yeah.
That now that we know, you're like, oh my God, Catelyn will never see her daughters again, which is so much more poignant given her journey and her arc is all about doing whatever it takes to get her daughters back, even go against the wishes of her son, who is now the king of the North. It's when you see these scenes, then you're just like, oh, Sansa, don't do it. Stay with your mother. It's that we all have that feeling when you rewatch movies and whatnot. It's like, don't down that road. But I find both Catelyn and Cersei very sort of sympathetic and tragic in seeing them in this moment, because I think even Cersei kind of likes Sansa. I think she sees herself in Sansa when she says, beautiful girls shouldn't be kept up north like this. And her interest in her is not completely cold at this point, I don't think. I think
I agree.
Recognizes a pretty girl who has an opportunity, because that's what Cersei did. She was a pretty girl that, managed to end up marrying the king and is trying to claim some sense of power or ownership. That, and so she could see Sansa being somebody similar to herself.
Yeah, I am always fascinated with the relationship between Cersei and Sansa. It's a troubled one. It's a bad one, but we do see that Sansa does have some affinity for her and learn some lessons, as Jon points out to her. A lot of stuff. Great stuff, Rachel. Great stuff. Favorite moments, lines, or scenes? What do you have? Anything there that you just forget the big themes and the lessons we're learning, Rachel? You look back and you go, man, I love that.
Yeah. I love the scene between Jaime and Cersei when we first meet them, and it's just so Jaime, the way that he talks about what is it, the job of the hand.
Oh yeah.
The hours are too long and the lives are too short, or something like.
No, you and I are synced up there, because I wrote it down. Their days are too long, their lives are too short. I love that little moment.
Yeah. And even preceding that, when he's talking about Robert will choose a new hand of the king, someone to do his job while he's off. Can I swear?
Sure.
He's off fucking boars and hunting whores. Or is it the other way around? Yeah. It's almost Tyrion-esque. You could see Tyrion saying that, but it's funny to me that they really, again, if we're talking about journeys, because very few characters go on as incredible a journey as Jaime does, this is where he starts. So we're going to make him as irreverent, as cold, as almost ridiculous as possible.
Yeah.
At the beginning, and then we're going to see where he goes. I also adore his exchange with Ned. And Ned's like, I don't play in tournaments because I don't want my opponent to know what I can do. And Jaime's like, nope, I can respect that.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, and the tension, and then of course, obviously, it's so good. It's so good between them there too. Yeah. Any other? I'm sure you and I could talk for 2 more hours about favorite little moments in every episode. But any more on your list there?
Like I said, with little moments, because the big ones are important and everything. But even Catelyn and Maester Luwin walking through the hall, and she's like, make sure Lord Tyrion has enough candles in his room. I hear he likes to read a lot, and Luwin's like, I hear he likes to drink a lot. And she makes a joke about how much can somebody of that stature really drink, and we haven't met Tyrion yet, so it's a great prelude to that. And then for him not to be with the procession, and then the first time we see him is with Roz, and that sort of just like lead up is very well. It seems almost throwaway, but we're still getting character information that I really like.
Yeah, there you go. And talk about going back and fixing exposition and how they got it out. I think they did a bang up job if that's some of the stuff there. Yeah. And that all leads again to Tyrion's wig that we'll never see again. Some of the ones I love, and then jump in here, obviously, too, Rachel, if you get some more. I always talk about this, the cold opening. People always like, hey, Ken, how'd you get into Game of Thrones? Did you read the books? No, I watched the show first. Oh, what pulled you into the show? 30 seconds in, the cold open, with me going, oh, this is everything I thought or heard it might be, and it's also nothing I expected. And the little girl reveal, her on the tree and then not on the tree. I scare easily, Rachel. Don't watch a lot of horror pictures. That got me. I was like, I am scared and intrigued all at the same time, and I love it.
Yeah. They nailed the fantasy is what starts the show, and it's horror fantasy, and it's stakesy fantasy. I mean, two characters. We meet three characters. For anybody just watching that, those are three main characters. They're three characters. Right. You know, you got to know them. Two die within next to no time, and pretty much the scene after the main credits, the next one dies. So it's like, oh, you know, it's a lot to take in. It's very, very well done. The score, they keep that theme for the White Walkers through the whole series. I mean, they embellish on it, and Ramin Djawadi does amazing music across the board. But I also like it when the theme falls out and you just hear the wind and the snow and the sound design, and it's so creepy. And, you know, and the design of the White Walkers changes a little bit. They get a little lighter. They're not quite as dark as they are in this one, but still they kept with the idea, because the idea is damn creepy.
Yeah. And I always said they were definitely more creepy for me. Once you kind of see them, it's not about the design. It's just once you see them, you're familiar with them and you're almost like, cool, I'm expecting it. But back then I was freaked out about that. And you mentioned it. You know, my other little favorite moment of the show, the opening credits, because it's Ramin Djawadi's music. It's that opening sequence, which is now iconic. And how dare anyone, if you skip intro on HBO Max, if you're watching, how dare you skip that? I mean, come on. But yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, because again, I'm not sure. I've heard the books, but not read them. And then that opening, I'm like, what am I watching? And then boom, into this great music, into this world. And I'm like, what is all this things that I'm looking at? That's where the world first saw it. And it's so big.
Yeah.
Going on here. Ned, I love Ned and Robert talking, and Ned says the Targaryens are gone, which now we know has a lot of weight, but Robert say not all of them. And on that, we cut to Dany.
Yeah. Yep. Those are throw cuts. That's so well done, because you need those points where it's like, you just talked about, you know, and I love it's I don't want to be those people, but it's like, we know he says talking about Rhaegar. I kill him every night in my sleep. And it's like, anybody who's not aware of that, it's like, well, that sounds serious. Who's that? What's happening? What's going on? And then they're all gone, and then you cut to, and you get a whole new family, the Targaryens. And it's just and Mark Addy just nails it, you know, that feeling of clearly he lost something that it doesn't look like he cares about much, but you believe that he cared about Lyanna.
Yeah, and again, with Ned saying it, and we know what he's hiding, you know, his purpose and all that stuff. I never want to dig too deep, but I just love in watching it this time, and now having all 8 seasons. Again, love it or hate it, love or hate some of the decisions or where it ends up. It's a different conversation. But I love watching this now when the Targaryens are gone, and we're like Ned, the good guy, his buddy Robert, and those Targaryens don't seem good. It seems ominous, seems like not good for this land. And you cut to Dany, who we're going to be rooting for years, but in the end wasn't good for this land or some decisions, which is way more complicated than just a general statement that I just said. To me, that now has more meaning as I look at it now. Like, oh, wow.
Yep. Nope. And I feel like that was absolutely what Martin's intention was. You know?
I agree with that. You mentioned some of my favorite little moments, that the days are long, the lives are too short. I love the King's arrival from the King's Road, majestic music.
Yeah.
And Rachel, you know me well. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Jorah. Showing up to be Jorah. God,
I knew it.
Any other favorite little moments, and we'll start wrapping up our fun breakdown here of the Winter's Coming pilot.
I'll just give a shout out to Direwolves, because I love them. And in particular, Jon finding Ghosts gets me right here every time. So very, very grateful he made it through.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Who do you think is the star of the episode? You can hand out little sub awards, but who do you think is the one to take it home in this episode?
It would be very easy to say Tyrion. I mean, Peter Dinklage from the get-go understood that character, and bad wig aside, really, nailed it. And he has basically the big line of the episode to Jon, and you really get the feeling of a very complicated, interesting, very important character right from the get-go. And I think that that's what you want in a pilot. But my favorite part about the pilot is it's twofold, because it's Ned and Robert's relationship. I think Sean Bean and Mark Addy knock it out of the park, from the opening "You're Fat" line to everything in the crypts. The way that they talk to each other, you just feel the years of friendship behind it. You feel the loyalty to each other. You feel how they've gone in different directions, but they're sort of reunited in the fact that their father figure is dead, that they do understand the positives, but also the faults of each other. I mean, Robert's actually pretty self-aware, in terms of he's not very good at this. I got all this advice from John Aaron. I didn't listen to it. And he's very aware of that as his best friend. And that connection through Lyanna is just so poignant. And I think both of those actors embodied not just their respective characters, but that relationship together, because it is so integral to, the dominoes that are about to fall in terms of the plot. I just, every time I watch it, I think both of them just know that.
This is not a contest. You and I are not competing for points here, but you're right. You won that round, because that's the answer to me. Sean Bean and Mark Addy, stars of the episode. And I look at Sean Bean and I go, he has to sell being the lead of this show, regardless of what we know happened.
It's happening 9 episodes.
He's on the poster. He is Sean Bean. He is Boromir. He's 006. He's a lot of these things we know. And just the way we have been trained to watch things, we're like, oh, it's his story. Even though what you said earlier is presented right from the start. Legacy, passing things on. It's right there in front of us. But we are trained, but he has to sell that to a worldwide audience, many not familiar with this, and he has to live up to the expectations. I look at him in this episode and I go, yeah, I think he nailed it. Mark Addy as Robert Baratheon right there with him. Great stuff. As we wrap up, Rachel, your favorite quote of this episode is?
Oh boy. Can I just cop out and say that it's the Tyrion one, which now that I'm scrolling through my notes, I can't find me.
You're talking about the main theme, the big one?
Yeah.
Never forget what you were. The rest of the world will not wear like armor. It can never be used to hurt you.
Against you. And it's so telling, because in some ways it can be, it's not a bulletproof comment. There are ways that it's used against them and hurts them greatly. But it still speaks to, I think, what we talked about being the largest theme being identity, and the journeys that they'll all go on, trying to find their identities, fine-tune those identities, and be okay with those identities, even if maybe they didn't at the beginning. And I did so much. You put that in the middle of a diagram and everything shoots off of that for me in terms of the show, and he delivers it perfectly. And the fact that it's to Jon means everything as two of the main characters. So I'll go with the obvious choice.
No, I think it's the obvious answer is the answer. I would say the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword has its own legacy, and people love that, like we talked about. And you brought some excellent stuff behind that line. I think it's great. But yeah, Tyrion, that's the one that stands out, and it's quoted, or sort like me, sort of quoted. I have to write these down because I'm so bad with quotes. But yeah, no, I think it is. I think it's the heart of this show, heart of this episode, which fuels the heart of the show, and the pursuit. And what you said, George R. R. Martin and Outsiders, it's big with him, and that doesn't stop.
Right.
All right, we did it. It's a supersized edition. We also wanted to talk a lot about context up top. Going forward, I always want to, not take too much of the audience's time to dive in here, but a supersized episode. And Rachel, I'm so glad you were here. I could not have done this episode without you. And you're such a key part to just talking Game of Thrones over here in Casterly Talk. So we definitely going to have you back as often as possible. But I want to let people know what you're doing, where they can follow you. And I say that normally in the past, I know you've been like, yeah, I'm just a really super talented editor. I just love movies. But you are, as we mentioned earlier, the new co-host of Schmodown Backstage on the SEN network.
Yes. catch me there on Tuesdays from 12:30 to 2:30, starting in 2 weeks. The incomparable John Roca is got 2 weeks left, and then he'll be stepping down to focus on his own channel, which is completely understandable. But yeah, I've been eager to still be a part of the Schmodown, even though I don't compete, and I would never ever be a manager. My hat's off to you, sir. That is not a job for me. You kind of fell into it too.
It's not a job for me either, Rachel.
But I feel like being a commentator, somebody who gets to talk about the matches and analyze them, and hopefully pass on, whatever knowledge I gained from being a competitor for as long as I was.
Well, look, if you approach it with even just 10% of what you brought to this episode and would have always brought to the Game of Thrones discussions, backstage, John Roca is a great broadcaster and Schmodown pundit. Ben Bateman's still there, going to be great, but I think you're going to help take it to new levels. I'm excited for you to do that. Excited for everyone over there. So for those out there watching and listening, thank you. Again, if you're listening to the podcast, you want to go to the YouTube, you can check it out. You can see our faces while we're talking about this. It is a podcast being captured by video on my YouTube channel. You can go to kennapzok.com for all other things I do, including my book, Why We Love Star Wars. If you if you never really heard me before and you like to dive into the themes, we do that over on Force Center with Star Wars. Me and Joseph Scrimshaw and Jennifer Landa. Check me out there. That is it for this week, everybody. The rewatch continues next week with The King's Road, and we'll meet you on it. Bye.